working, hopefully it's working better than my voice. It's that time of the year where it wasn't my patient who gave me this husky tone, it's my daughter, but never mind. Thank you for coming along to the Chronic and Curious evening number 1, which is brought to you by the Wellington faculty, and Wellington faculty is trying to make sure we encourage collegiality and some education as well. So tonight we've got a returning speaker. Last year Dr. Aaron Culver gave a talk on youth mental health, depression, suicidality. It was a fascinating and interesting talk, and I'm sure tonight will be as well. Aaron's my brother-in-law, and I've known him for many years, an old classmate, and my sister-in-law's up there with the camera as well. And one of the reasons that Aaron's here is a personal relationship with ME CFS. So he was telling me that it's an unusual talk for him because this is not his area of expertise. His area of expertise is being a child and adolescent psychiatrist. But it will be talk of a journey and some useful information as well. So, thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, Richard. Kia ora koutou. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Right, I'm going to stand here because we couldn't find the clicker to advance the slides, so I'll be using the mouse. Yeah, so I do feel like a bit of a fraud actually, a bit outside my comfort zone, because I don't consider myself an expert on ME CFS, apart from a range of things really, but you know, having a reasonable understanding of the literature is one of them. And I guess I'm not sure that there are many people who would be experts on ME CFS, and that's perhaps one reason to talk about it. So thanks for having me along. So I first got interested in ME CFS when I was a trainee intern on elective in about 1991, well actually 1991, in a place in mid-north coast of Wales. I was doing paediatrics there with local paediatrician, and he ran ME CFS clinic as a kind of interest. And he was the only person in that whole region who was doing that. And even though he's a paediatrician, he was seeing adults as well in that clinic. And I used to sit in with him, and I was just staggered by the level of disability that people were presenting with this disorder that I'd never even heard of. So that was quite a stark introduction. And I guess apart from seeing a number of kids over the years presenting with ME CFS who've been referred to CAMS and for mental health assessments, didn't really give it much more thought until my oldest son, Max, came down with ME, and now we have 2 of our 3 sons have ME. So I have a personal connection with it, and that's meant that I've become something of an expert on the literature, or at least done a deep dive into the literature in terms of trying to work out, well, what does work and what is the evidence. And I guess that's been a bit of a journey of discovery in terms of, A, this fascinating disorder, and B, the treatment that it's received, particularly over the last kind of 30 years. And our relationship with it. So I guess that's what I'm hoping to do. I don't really think I can give you short takes on top treatment tips for ME CFS because I don't have that level of experience or expertise, and that information is just not easily available. Studying literature, it becomes really clear that A, the literature is pretty deficient, and B, it's really broad and hard to really penetrate. So I guess if I'd like to achieve anything, it's kind of conveying that we need a slightly different understanding of ME CFS, and that the way that we conceptualise the disorder perhaps has been a little bit hijacked. So just in terms of what I hope to cover, and I was saying to Richard, I've got way too many slides and this should actually be a workshop. Because it's actually kind of hard to refine the detail down into bite-sized chunks. But we're going to talk about outbreaks, a little bit about the history, because whenever I'm presenting on any kind of mental illness, I like to present on history to give context of our current understanding. And I think the ME/CFS is a disorder that the history really adds something. Making sense of the symptoms, co-occurring, and otherwise standard presentation. So what is it? Well, serious chronic multi-system disease that frequently and dramatically limits the quality of life and activities of people. It is classified in ICD-10 as a neurological condition, and in fact has been classified in ICD as a neurological condition since 1969. That hasn't changed, and there's no intent to change it. So one of the really fascinating aspects of ME/CFS is, the number of names it's had over the years, but also the history of outbreaks. There are many documented outbreaks over the last century. Some of the biggest ones, 1934, 200 members of staff at Los Angeles County General Hospital. That was thought to be atypical poliomyelitis. Everybody had an infectious onset. In fact, in all of the outbreaks, pretty much all of the cases had a clearly demarcated infectious onset. 1955 Royal Free Hospital was probably the biggest and the most famous, where about 75% of the medical and nursing staff developed a flu-like illness followed by what was at the time termed myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is what the disease came to be known as, because that's what the people investigating the Royal Free outbreak called it. And that was based on some post-mortem findings of significant inflammation around the base of the, mid-brain, brainstem and spinal cord. Mercy Stone 1 outbreak in 1975 in Sacramento, 200 people, again, staff and contacts. And this is a familiar theme, is that a lot of these outbreaks have been around hospitals. They've had an infectious start, and many of the sufferers have been healthcare workers. Lake Tahoe is probably another one of the more famous ones. Incline Village in Lake Tahoe, 1984, 175 residents came down with it. And, this is one of the first documented outbreaks where there was significant difference of opinion emerging. So the investigators felt that they'd pretty confidently isolated HHV6 amongst most of the people who developed the disorder. The CDC, without actually examining anybody, described it as a disease of depressed menopausal women, which was curious because actually it affected pretty much all groups in the village, children, males, females. But I think that was perhaps, one of the earlier signs that that things were about to get complicated. 85, Lindenville outbreak, another 200 cases following 8 index flu-like cases, highly contagious flu-like illness. And most of these outbreaks, there's been around about 40 to 75% progression following the infectious illness into a ME/CFS state, i.e. quite severe fatigue. 5 outbreaks between 34 and 96 documented across 17 countries. So, one of the interesting things from this is that if we're thinking that this may be a post-infectious, disorder with a clear pathophysiological basis, then it must be one that occurs amongst predisposed individuals. So for that to happen, it must be a fairly commonly occurring predisposition to mutation, which is kind of interesting looking at some of the most recent research, which is verifying exactly that. So we had our own outbreak, pretty small by international comparisons, but it was ours. 28 cases, and this was, the main investigator here was a GP called Peter Snow, who was pretty dogged in, trying to find a basis for the outbreak. And interestingly, in his reflections when he retired, he noted that the problem at the time was getting anybody to take notice of the fact that this was an actual disease. Now it seemed as though everything was being called chronic fatigue, and it was a bit of a garbage bin diagnosis. And by his estimates, only about 5% of the people presenting with fatigue at the end of his career, he felt, would have met criteria for the disorder he knew during this outbreak. Which again was a bit prescient, as we'll find out in a bit. But of course, most cases aren't associated with outbreaks. And whilst, without exception, the investigators of these outbreaks believed that there was a physical cause underlying the disorder, there hasn't been the understanding recently. So most cases occur de novo. Still around about 50 to 60% of non-outbreak based ME/CFS have an identified post-infectious onset, so it's still a really common feature. Although often we find that onset's episodic over months. The idea of a sudden and dramatic onset does happen, but it's actually not the norm. The norm is a gradual onset, and often in a stepwise fashion. There seems to be a lot of heterogeneity in people presenting with ME/CFS. So are there lots of subgroups with overlapping kind of presentations? Is there a common core pathology? It'd be nice to be able to answer those questions, but we can't. So yeah, I'm being a bit clever with this. If it's a play on words, it's got a double meaning. So just looking back more at the history, I mean, ME/CFS is often thought of as being a relatively recent diagnosis, that it, presented itself during the 1980s and has begun to be described since that time, which is not true at all. There are pretty clear cases described throughout the literature dating back to at least 1750. In the States in 1869, Beard, who was a psychiatrist, described the condition of neurasthenia. That stuck for a while, until it got taken over by the psychodynamic psychotherapists and got ditched. But it's a very similar sounding condition. In 1957, Ramsey was one of the core investigators of the Royal Free outbreak, and he defined the term myalgic encephalomyelitis, which was a diagnosis based on a presumptive pathophysiology that was not ultimately established. So that's the first time that the term ME came into literature. In 1969, ME was classified as a neurological disorder in ICD. But during the 1980s, and this stemmed from a paper in the late 70s written by a couple of psychiatrists in the UK who gave an opinion of the Royal Free outbreak that it was psychogenic mass hysteria. They hadn't actually interviewed any of the patients who suffered in the outbreak and hadn't talked to any of the investigators. So they'd kind of plucked this idea out of thin air that it was psychogenic, and they were really rubbished at the time for their method and their conclusions. But there'd been, throughout last century, there'd been kind of suggestions that it wasn't a physical condition, that it was a psychogenic condition. That gained some popularity during the kind of 20s and 30s when psychodynamic psychotherapy was at its peak. Then it waned, and then it came back again in the 1980s for reasons which weren't entirely clear. But it wasn't until 1988 that the term chronic fatigue syndrome was actually coined, which is, in the scheme of things, is pretty recently. And the idea of calling it chronic fatigue syndrome was because they wanted a name that was free from etiological implications. They hadn't been able to find a pathological basis for ME. Therefore, ME didn't seem like a very suitable name. So they called it chronic fatigue syndrome, which I think was a pretty unfortunate start of a range of events, or a cascade of events, because really it defined the syndrome around the singular symptom of fatigue, and that had not been the case up to that point. Following that, in 1991, the Oxford Research Criteria, that was a consensus-based criteria, a group of specialists led by psychiatrists met in Oxford in the UK, and over a weekend they defined a set of diagnostic criteria called the Oxford criteria. And I'll go through these criteria in a bit because they're quite interesting in mapping out how our understanding has progressed over the last kind of 30 odd years. They didn't last long. They only lasted 3 years before they were superseded because they were pretty loose. They were a good first effort. They were superseded by the Fukuda Research Diagnostic Criteria developed by the Centre for, what does CDC stand for? Centre for Disease Control, I think, in the US. And they became the standard research criteria and standard diagnostic criteria for about a decade, until the Canadian criteria were developed. Now, the Fukuda criteria were much tighter, as we'll see, than the Oxford criteria, but the Canadian criteria were tighter again. And again, the Canadian criteria became a standard. There was an international consensus criteria which loosened it off a little bit in 2011, but really the gold standard now is the Institute of Medicine criteria. That again was a consensus-based and research-based program. So they basically reviewed over 10,000 articles on ME/CFS, the entire literature. They got pretty much every expert in the States together, and they developed over a period of 6 months a consensus framework for understanding ME/CFS, including what they felt to be a robust diagnostic criteria with reasonable validity in terms of caseness, and that's not something that we'd ever had before. Nobody had ever tested the validity of these diagnostic criteria to define caseness. Now that's something that we understand in mental health because there's no blood test for most of the disorders that we diagnose, so we have to continually refine our diagnostic criteria to be sure that we're describing the same thing in a repeatable way. They also published a really significant document beyond ME/CFS, which is worth a read, and they renamed the disorder Systemic Exertion Intolerance Disorder, and they thought that was great because they'd finally shaken the CFS mantle. But everybody thought that was a really crap name, and it never took, so that one went bye-bye. So we're still stuck with ME/CFS. So you can see from this, Oxford Research Criteria basically is about fatigue. And again, this was a good start at the time. Severe disabling, affects physical and mental functioning, has to be there for 6 months, at least half the time. Other symptoms may be present. And that's about as far as they went. So this essentially cast the net very wide. What this did was define an incredibly heterogeneous group of people who had fatigue as a core symptom. And fatigue is an incredibly common symptom of many, many disease processes. You know, it's pretty much ubiquitous. So trying to define a syndrome on a single symptom was never going to fly that well, and it didn't. They interestingly also described a variant called post-infectious fatigue syndrome, which never really took off either. Then came the Fukuda. So they stuck with the fatigue more than 6 months. Severe impact on functioning, and that's a hallmark of all of the diagnostic criteria. With 4 or more of post-exertional malaise, poor sleep, cognitive, muscle, joint pain, headaches, tender lymph nodes, sore throat. So one of the criticisms of Fukuda is that it's still too wide. It still defines a really heterogeneous population. Canadian criteria were really the beginning of the more definitive diagnostic and research criteria. So this requires physical and mental fatigue that substantially reduces activity, and it started to grapple with the idea of what the hell is fatigue? You know, what is that? How do you actually define it as a symptom? Surely it's a totally subjective sensation. So how can that be the core feature of an entire disease process? So they started to think, what does fatigue actually mean? And research was developing that actually highlighted, well, it's actually post-exertional malaise, which is one of the core features of the disorder. And you can't actually make a diagnosis of ME/CFS without the presence of post-exertional malaise. So they acknowledged that, as has every criteria since then. Sleep disturbance, pain, neurological and cognitive symptoms, and recognising that there are autonomic manifestations, neuroendocrine, and immune manifestations, and grouping them into those categories, which was a interesting new take. So just jumping straight now to the current criteria, Institute of Medicine criteria. These are the ones that mostly are being used in current research and clinical practice. So these require impairment of functioning across multiple domains. So noticing, accompanied by profound fatigue, not alleviated by rest. So the fatigue has to be profound. It's not the result of another disease process, it's not the result of exertion in the absence of post-exertional malaise. But the core feature here is actually impairment of functioning rather than fatigue. So fatigue's taking a bit of a back seat there. And there must be post-exertional malaise. I'll get on to defining that in a bit. And unrefreshing sleep. So those are the big three. They must be present for a diagnosis. And then you need one of cognitive impairment or orthostatic intolerance. And as we'll see, most people have both. So where are we now? Well, we still really lack a universally accepted case definition. While most people who are working regularly with ME/CFS are using ION, there's a really broad range of practice in terms of people clinging to old categories, and some people are still using the Oxford classification. A lot of people still believe that fatigue is a central feature, but actually it isn't. The core discriminating feature of ME/CFS is post-exertional malaise. Many clinicians would consider that the fatigue is caused by the post-exertional malaise, which we'll get onto in a minute. And in fact, when you look through literature, post-exertional malaise is not really found in any other disorder. So it is something that is fairly unique to ME/CFS and is the core discriminating kind of feature. A lot of disorders present with fatigue, as we've found. I mean, there was a really nice study of 1,400 people. They called 1,400 people who suffered from fatigue that impaired their functioning, and asked them to come forward to be assessed. Well, they called for people and they got 1,400. And so they assessed all of those 1,400 people, and of them, 69 met even the Fukuda criteria for ME/CFS. So 5%. So Peter Snow was pretty spot on. Of all the people who might get thrown into that kind of broad category of ME/CFS because we're not quite sure what's wrong with them, or we can't find anything wrong with them, around about 5% will actually meet formal diagnostic criteria for ME/CFS. So one of the things that the whole chronic fatigue syndrome kind of mantle has done is severely disadvantage people who had ME from the pre-1988 diagnostic criteria. It has kind of taken their plight and made the basically corrupted research and treatment paradigms with a much larger, wider, more heterogeneous group of people who suffer from a much broader range of conditions. And that's been a real problem. It's kind of caused about a 30-year deviation and hold-up in decent research and progress in treatment. So one of the other core things is that in a heterogeneous population, you've got mild, moderate, and severe sufferers. The probability of a valid diagnosis increases with the severity of the disorder and the symptoms, including the severity of impairment. So if you've got somebody presenting with severe impairment based on fatigue, post-exertional malaise, sleep difficulties, then they're more likely to have ME. I'm going to have to hurry up a bit. So, making sense of symptoms. I mean, this is what we're faced with. Clinically, this is what you have to deal with. You know this, don't you? I'm not telling anything new here. This is the hard thing. This is what it's like. How do you make sense of this? How do you get a diagnosis out of that? And the answer is, you do this. You look at the diagnostic criteria. Because without those diagnostic criteria, how could you possibly make sense? I'm happy for these slides to go around as well, so if you want them. So you need all three of the top line, of the top ones in blue: fatigue, post-exertional malaise, unrefreshing sleep, and then one cognitive impairment and/or orthostatic intolerance. If you don't have that, then you don't have ME/CFS. This is just a nice little outcome from the IOM project. And interestingly, this stimulated a bunch of new research funding in the US to develop collaborative centres of research to better understand ME/CFS and try and find pathophysiology. And that's actually reaping pretty significant rewards. There have been some pretty major breakthroughs just over the last year or two. Which I'm happy to go into if we've got time at the end, but we probably won't. Another name that's being presented is post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion. Again, that's a bit of a mouthful. So we're kind of sticking with ME/CFS. But these are the systems that it covers. It is a multi-system disorder, which of course is what's made it so difficult to pin down. But it's actually the, age-old medical practice of observation and classification and refinement, which has kind of got us to a more sophisticated understanding of what the disorder actually is. So what is this post-exertional malaise thing? Basically, it's a worsening of symptoms after even minimal exertion. I mean, people who suffer with ME call it push-crash cycle. If they push themselves, then they crash, and they are a lot worse. And it takes a long time to recover from those crashes. And some people never recover. With each crash, there is a stepwise deterioration, which is why a lot of people with ME actually think that it's the other way around, that the post-exertional malaise, the push and crash cycle, causes the fatigue. Because malaise kind of is fatigue. You push yourself, you go beyond your energy envelope, a crash ensues, you never quite get back to where you were. So with each successive crash, your fatigue worsens. So it's kind of, the PEM leads to fatigue rather than the other way around. It's physical and mental exertion in almost all cases. It's hard to find somebody who doesn't suffer from the neurocognitive effects of post-exertional malaise. The onset can be delayed, most often around about by 24 hours, so it'll be the next day. And some people will recover from that back to baseline, but some people it will define a new set point of decreased functioning that they never recover from. There's no other disorder that does this. And particularly, cardiopulmonary exercise testing, measuring VO2 max, measuring anaerobic threshold, is really distinctive findings in people with ME/CFS. That are distinct to the disorder. They don't occur with any other disorder. It's pretty much any other disorder, whether you've got heart failure, whether you've got renal failure, whether you've got lung disease. If you do a 2-day CPET, you will be able to achieve pretty much the same functioning on the second day as on the first day. That's not the case with ME/CFS. And ME/CFS, most people achieve about 50% of what they achieved on the first day on the second day. There have been a lot of studies that have looked at CPET and only done one day, and they've found that the results weren't particularly abnormal. When you do 2 days, you find that the results are dramatically abnormal and persistently abnormal. And abnormal in a way that doesn't occur with any other disorder.
Sorry, can you remind us, ADHD people, what CPET means?
Yeah, cardiopulmonary exercise testing, exercise physiology testing. You get on the bike and you've got the oxygen mask on, and it's measuring your CO2 output, it's measuring your oxygen uptake, so it's working out what your maximal exercise threshold is based on measuring your anaerobic threshold, the point at which you move from aerobic metabolism into anaerobic metabolism, and your maximal uptake of oxygen, and your heart rate and all that kind of stuff. It's fancy exercise testing.
The government's in the paper, so we can't test it anymore.
We can't really do it here. There's a few people who do it in private. And Massey University have got an exercise physiology lab at the Wellington campus. But it's kind of hard to get access to here. But these are studies that have been done overseas and replicated pretty well. So something's going on there, and this is the comparison with control groups. So those with a diagnosis of ME/CFS who experience different forms of post-exertional malaise. So it's pretty much across the range, and fatigue can't be defined as just one type of experience. It's it's tiredness, it's feeling drained, it's having dead muscles, it's feeling mentally tired, it's soreness. It's all of those things. So fatigue is a kind of multifaceted experience. Which is why I think they call it malaise, which is semantics in some ways. Sleep is one of the other core features, and again it's quite varied. Often, particularly in adolescent onset, it will start out with hypersomnia, but it will evolve over the course of the illness. It will vary at different stages, and it's kind of difficult to pin down, but sleep architecture is always disordered. It's defining here. And the hypersomnia is kind of coma-like. It's incredibly hard to rouse people. They have a whole bunch of related sleep disorders, and often that sleep is really difficult to manage. But it's important to try and improve it because it has a big impact on quality of life and ability to function. Again, a number of people experience significant sleep problems compared with controls. Cognitive impairment is ubiquitous. It is a core feature of the disorder. To the point where I'd probably say that the disorder can't occur without some form of cognitive impairment. It's often described as brain fog, difficulty thinking. There are often a bunch of neurological signs as well. People can be ataxic, dysarthric. Of course, tremor, a number of focal signs. Cognitive impairment is a major contributor to school absence in adolescence. And it tends to be variable over time, and the current thinking around the cognitive impairment is that it's related to hypoperfusion, which is related to the orthostatic problems in ME/CFS. And there's a reasonable number of studies that are supportive of that, particularly one came out last year showing significant neuroinflammation in the brain in specific areas that were kind of quite repeated, and also lactic acid buildup. So it's hypoperfusion, hypometabolic state in the brain that's causing significant lactate buildup, which is further impairing function. As well as some gross morphological abnormalities, but they're not necessarily quite so significant in terms of repeatability. But so again, this is probably one of the most common features of ME/CFS. So the orthostatic stuff, what is it? I mean, it's got its own names. It's something that we've probably only really become particularly aware of over the last 10 years or so. POTS is a common name for it. It very much appears to be autonomic nervous system related, and there's one small study which has shown consistent small fibre polyneuropathy peripherally in people with ME/CFS. But again, a lot of these studies are quite small, and there's no current funding to kind of scale them up. So a lot of these are discovery-based studies, so I wouldn't put too much store into any particular single finding around particularly the orthostatic stuff, but there are really consistent findings when you look at them across the board. So POTS is the most common. Around up to about 90% of people with ME will have orthostatic dysfunction, orthostatic intolerance. That's always worth assessing for. To the point where it's not really clear if POTS is a separate disorder from ME/CFS, because there's a huge amount of overlap.
Could you tell us what POTS is?
Yeah, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which, you know, there's another one of those kind of acronyms that is a bit cute, but because postural and orthostatic essentially mean the same thing, of course, but OTS didn't sound quite as good. So how do you assess for it? Ideally you'd have a tilt table. Most of us don't have one. So it's pretty easy to do in a surgery if you've got 20 minutes. Basically, you lie down, get a person to lie down for 10 minutes, check their heart rate and blood pressure, and then you get them to stand up. And they can either stand up like this, which is not the gold standard, but it's adequate. If you want us to remove the stabilising effect of balance, then you get them to lean against the wall like this. Get them to stand up, lean against the wall with their feet at about a 45-degree angle, and measure their heart rate and blood pressure at 1 minute intervals for 10 minutes. And it's diagnostic if you get in children or adolescents a heart rate of more than 40 beats per minute increase, and in adults more than 30 beats per minute increase, or sustained over 120. And if there's a drop in blood pressure, it's not POTS. It's probably neurally mediated hypertension. Most often, particularly in adolescents, the blood pressure will increase. So here's a typical results of a tilt test, of a lean test rather. So you see a resting heart rate of 85, BP 101 over 61. At 1 minute, went up to 138, and 2 minutes, 159. So that's pretty diagnostic of POTS. And it was would have been sustained if they could have tolerated any further. Which kind of brings us on to the idea of ME/CFS and co-occurring conditions. And it's not really clear whether these are co-occurring, whether they're contributing, or whether they're part of the core pathology, because they tend to cluster around each other. There's a whole bunch of conditions that end up with a kind of a similar final common pathway or phenomenology that we don't really understand that well. So one of the ones that are often mentioned that come up and that really need to be investigated and kind of delineated are the autonomic dysfunction like POTS, mast cell activation syndrome. There's again a fairly recent linkage with ME/CFS in that a lot of people with mast cell activation appear to present with ME/CFS, but actually when you put them on decent antihistamines, their symptoms go away. It can be curative, which doesn't happen in people with ME/CFS. Fibromyalgia is another one. Hypermobility syndromes like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Lyme disease is not so popular here, but it's a big thing over in the States. And kind of it's the disease du jour, but it does have a lot of overlap with POTS. And it does need to be diagnosed if you live in the kind of southwestern US. No. Eastern, yeah, northeastern, eastern US, yeah. Does need to be diagnosed because it is treatable, especially in the early stages. And the latest one is craniocervical instability, which one of the paediatric experts, in fact he's probably the biggest paediatric experts, has been talking about some time and always just seemed a little bit nutty. But actually, there is really something in it, and we don't quite understand what that is yet. There is a subgroup of people who have atlantoaxial instability, and when they have spinal fusion, their symptoms are cured. And in fact, walking around on a hard collar even improves their symptoms. So there's something about perhaps compression of the brainstem, particularly involvement of the raphe nuclei, but you know, it's conjecture. We don't know. Some people it works. Not suggesting that you should recommend cervical spine fusion for your patient presenting with fatigue, though. So just looking at the comorbidity and co-occurrence of mental illness, there's not, the rates of mental illness in people with ME/CFS are about what you'd expect for anybody presenting with a chronic disabling illness. The kind of weird thing is they should be higher, because often people presenting with ME/CFS feel a special sense of hopelessness. They feel kind of lost in the system. There's a kind of sense of stigma that they don't feel believed, or that people don't believe it's a real disorder, that there's no treatment. They see the long-term outcomes for people with ME/CFS, and that's pretty miserable. They achieve a late diagnosis, and there's a lot of kind of distress and uncertainty in that process. And it's hard to resolve that uncertainty for people. It would be nice if we could move to a state where we have, screening, early detection and early intervention for ME/CFS. Because I think that outcomes will be improved simply with that, even if we don't have a really clear, robust treatment paradigm yet. But really, they're no different. The rates of personality disorder are not elevated. Physiological findings between depression and ME/CFS are markedly different. It's illness severity, not psychological factors, which predict outcome in ME/CFS. So, mental illness is a really important factor to be considering from the point of view of rates are increasing in anybody who present with a chronic disabling condition. And we should always be looking at how to provide supportive care and how to diagnose comorbid mental illness in people with chronic disabling conditions. And ME/CFS is no different. There is an increased suicide rate. It's thought to be upwards of 8%, and that tends to be in people with long-term severe disability. This is just a really busy table which you probably can't read, which essentially outlines in adolescence the differences between ME/CFS presentations and depression and anxiety, and the diagnostic criteria required for each. What it very nicely says is that you cannot meet diagnostic criteria for depression or anxiety if you have ME/CFS alone, and vice versa. There is minimal overlap between the diagnostic criteria for both. So the idea that ME/CFS is atypical depression, or that everybody with ME/CFS has anxiety, doesn't actually hold much water. So what's the epidemiology? Again, there's a few myths floating around here, but the answer is it depends. It depends on what criteria you use and how you go about assessing it, which population you choose and how you exclude people from your epidemiological studies. Probably the best one we've got is the 2011 one, which used the Canadian criteria. 143,000 people in the States, aged 18 to 28 and 64 rather. 2 to 4 per thousand. So that's just adults. When you add in the adolescent onset group, you're probably looking at maybe 5 to 7 per thousand. So in a practice of, say, practice population of 2,000 people, you should probably have 10 to 12, 14 people with ME/CFS. I mean, does that seem about right? Is that a reasonable ballpark from your experience? Probably varies, but yeah. So it's common, it might be more common than that because a lot of ME/CFS goes undiagnosed. There's a bimodal age of onset. So there's two peaks, one in adolescence and one in, early mid-adult. And we don't know why that is. We've got no idea why there are two peaks of onset, but there are, and that's been a really consistent feature over the decades. So we have almost two separate disorders, one where there is an onset amongst adolescents and one in adults, and they look quite different in many ways because adolescents are always going to present in a different way than adults. And the outcomes are different. I mean, kids tend to do better, possibly because they heal better, but they still do pretty poorly. Adults do better in different ways because they've got fully developed personalities by the time they get unwell. They've often got relationships, they've got support caregivers established, they've got careers often, and they've got a bit of emotional maturity. So it is always going to look like a different disorder, but it's pretty devastating in adolescence where it takes young people out of school during core developmental time. They lose those core developmental kind of experiences and tasks. And they've got a lot of catch up if they recover. It was always thought of, you look at textbooks and they say 80% females, and in fact it's not, and it never was. And in fact most of the outbreaks are about 50-50. But the rates vary from about 60-40 to 65-35 female to male. So about 2 to 1. All ethnicities, all countries. It's not a Western disorder. All social classes, and the gradient actually increases with deprivation. So it's not actually a yuppie flu, and it's not actually a disorder of overachievers. It's actually more predominant in people who, are poor. Not by a huge gradient, but there is a gradient. There is no specific personality profile that predisposes you to ME/CFS. So being an overachiever is the kind of common, idea, but actually it's all kind of walks of life, all sorts of people. It's not necessarily people with the type A personality, but they might be the ones who are more successful in actually persisting with getting a diagnosis rather than giving up. It is pretty heritable. It runs in families. That's certainly been our experience, but it's true. There's a higher rate in first-degree relatives, 38% concordance amongst monozygotic twins. So there is something about a predisposition. And in fact, some of the genetic markers that have been thrown up are prevalent in about 40% of the population, which actually ties in with the theories around the outbreaks, that there had to be a genetic vulnerability that was prevalent in at least 40% of the population to get the kind of numbers that they were getting in those outbreaks. So that's where current thinking is kind of heading. What's the pathophysiology? I was just going to write a question mark here really, because actually we don't really know. But there is some interesting and pretty consistent findings. There are some significant immune function, disorders of immune functioning, particularly abnormal monoclonal T cell proliferation. So without any clear allergen or thing to fight, you get massive T cell proliferation, which is a really consistent feature in ME/CFS. You also get really this sort of natural killer cell function. We don't understand why that is. They just don't work as well. We've talked about the autonomic instability. Impaired temperature regulation is really common. Really common. In fact, the first kind of sign that we had that our youngest one was getting sick was when he got in the swimming pool and became hypothermic because he could not regulate his temperature. That was the first sign. So cognitive deficits, increasing research over the last 5 years around neuroinflammation. Cardiovascular, there's really consistent decreases in stroke volume, reduced blood volume, similar to high output heart failure, which kind of defines the POTS. Now, I mean, oftentimes that's been written off as the product of deconditioning, but in fact, invasive cardiopulmonary testing has shown that it's a very different profile to deconditioning, as does the non-invasive cardiopulmonary exercise testing. Really interesting study that came out last year was, amongst people with severe ME/CFS, all of them had reduced red blood cell deformability. The P was like 0.0001 in significance. And curiously, in 1986, just before ME/CFS was really defined, there was a really big paper that came out that found decreased red blood cell deformability in people with ME/CFS, and it was entirely forgotten. So somebody decided to repeat it, and they found exactly the same thing 30 years later. Metabolic, again, there are studies which show significant citric acid cycle deficits, decreased pyruvate dehydrogenase, decreased ATP production, and really significantly impaired oxidative phosphorylation, to the point where that's been thought of as being a bit of a metabolic signature. That oxidative phosphorylation, for some reason, the ability of the mitochondria to produce energy from fatty acids, is really disordered. Glucose metabolism tends not to be. So it's pretty hard to exercise because most of us use up our glucose stores within a pretty short order, and we rely on oxidative phosphorylation to create energy. If that's not working so well, then we fatigue and move into an anaerobic state really quickly, and that's what happens on the CPEC testing. People move into anaerobic metabolism really fast. There is a pretty well-defined metabolic signature, but again, that's in a relatively small number of people. I think it was about 40 cases. There are a lot of researchers in the States that have jumped on this. There's not much research money, but some big names have jumped onto this because I think it's becoming apparent that this may represent a really significant frontier in medicine. We don't actually understand much about disorders of human energy production. In fact, we don't even understand human energy production. We're not even sure what mitochondria are. We kind of assume that we know stuff, but in actual fact we don't. Our understanding of energy production is really basic. I think people are starting to see some Nobel Prizes, if they can crack this, and ME/CFS is a useful kind of disorder to try and crack it. So there's also been some application of big data approaches and studying entire genomes of people with severe ME/CFS with some really interesting outcomes. Disability is severe. I think everybody probably knows that. People have a poorer quality of life than many other chronic medical conditions, including grade 2 congestive heart failure. Nancy Klimas has been a long-time researcher. She was kind of the spearhead of AIDS research, HIV treatment. She's actually a lot older than that photo suggests. And she's an immunologist who specialises in both HIV and ME/CFS. And she's, gone on record as saying that if she had a choice between the two conditions, she'd choose HIV any day of the week. Recovery, pretty variable. It's really hard to predict. There's not really any good science to say who's going to recover and who's not. Recovery rates are pretty low at the moment. Better in adolescent onset than in adult onset. Some people will improve to the point where they reach a plateau, others will just keep on gradually improving, and some people are able to achieve a reasonable quality of life over time. So that's just some of the reflections of some of the researchers, in terms of just how meaningless the name chronic fatigue syndrome actually is these days. And from a patient in terms of chronic fatigue, trying to describe her lived experience and her own narrative of having ME, it's like it doesn't come close. This might be a standard formulation. Viral onset, perfectionist personality, tendency towards somatizing, become unhelpfully fixated on their symptoms, and develop a phobic avoidance of exercise. Pretty common. And a lot of people with ME do focus on their symptoms. But there are a whole range of reasons why they might do that. Partly because they're so understandable. You know, we decide that they've got a somatoform disorder or a functional neurological syndrome, otherwise known more recently as medically unexplained symptoms. They get positive reinforcement from the sick role and from contact with the health system. They become deconditioned. The deconditioning then reinforces their sense that something's wrong with them because they do normal exercise and they experience significant fatigue. But in fact, that's just a normal response. So they become more avoidant and more deconditioned. And they get into a vicious cycle of somatization. And if they had graded exercise and cognitive behavioural therapy, then they would be cured. That's a really common formulation, but in fact there's no good evidence to support any component of it. Which is where we get into some of the unfortunate kind of research, and my profession is pretty much culpable for that because it's pretty much our fault. It's the psychiatrists who've messed things up. The psychosomatic theory is actually the cognitive behavioural model of ME/CFS. That was posited as the causative and etiological kind of model. You start off with that normal illness belief that might come on after an infection. You kind of obsess about it. You develop a fear of exercise, which is reinforced by avoidance and deconditioning. And it goes round and round in a circle. And everything, all of the physical findings that we have are caused by deconditioning. Deconditioning explains everything. So therefore, recovery is dependent on effort. And we just have to get people to a point with cognitive behavioural therapy where they can overcome their fear of exercise, and graded exercise tolerance where we can just keep on increasing and increasing and increasing their exercise level to the point where they exercise their way out of illness. And just, I mean, that previous slide, just to the side, I mean, Nancy Clymer's also kind of pointed out quite rightly that multiple sclerosis was called hysterical paralysis up until we had technology to be able to, reliably diagnose it. And that's what ME/CFS has become. It's become the new historical paralysis. This is from 2015. This is a really common perception of ME/CFS. The worst thing of all is to join a sufferers group. People must be warned off it. I mean, actually, some of the sufferers group are pretty miserable because people suffer a lot. So I thought I'd find out if the bloody physician's going to have psychiatrically unexplained symptoms, medically unexplained symptoms, I thought I could coin a term called psychiatrically unexplained symptoms, because most of the physiological deficits in ME/CFS cannot be explained psychiatrically. I can't explain them. I can't explain why you have monoclonal T cell expansion or impaired oxidative phosphorylation. So I'm going to try and trademark this and promote a new disorder called PUS. And it's one that psychiatrists need to steer well clear of, because we just don't do PUS. What's the evidence around deconditioning? I've already covered this a bit. There was a decent study in 2002 that found on tilt table testing that people with ME/CFS have really high heart rate and low stroke volume. Somehow that managed to turn into the conclusion that it was all caused by deconditioning. It wasn't actually until 2018 that somebody came up with a really clever study protocol to completely refute that. Because if it was deconditioning, and deconditioning represented the severity of functional impairment, which by definition it must in the cognitive behavioural model, then you should get increasing severity of orthostatic changes with increasing severity of illness, because it's caused by deconditioning. But that's not what you see at all. The severity of the orthostatic changes is the same across mild, moderate and severe groups. And in fact, the orthostatic changes almost always precede deconditioning. And that's not to say that deconditioning doesn't happen, it does. Deconditioning is a real problem because people who have ME/CFS and can't exercise become deconditioned. So it's a double whammy. And a lot of our management needs to be on minimising deconditioning as much as possible. So deconditioning is real. It's just a bit ridiculous to say that every symptom in ME/CFS is caused by it. Deconditioning is an outcome and a cause. Yep, we covered that. I've just got a few slides left. Does everybody need to go, or do you want to stop now and have questions? I mean, what do you want to do? Carry on with the presentation, or? Okay. So that leads us on to trials of graded exercise therapy, and this is really important. So in a nutshell, there was a Cochrane review of 8 trials. So there was only 8 trials that actually met inclusion criteria. And this was in about 2006, 2007, I think. Those trials were the basis of finding that graded exercise therapy was effective in treating ME/CFS. What they didn't disclose was that 7 of those 8 trials were done by psychiatrists and psychologists who had made a career out of the belief that ME/CFS is psychogenic in its origin. To the point where their trial protocols actively promoted graded exercise therapy and CBT as an efficacious therapy. Now, one of the things that you don't do in trials of treatments that you can't blind is go in with a heavy treatment bias. You know, there's a pretty well established effect size that comes purely from the expectation of benefit in these trials. You cannot blind a study of CBT. It can't be blinded. So it's randomised, it's controlled, but it's not blinded. And all of the study authors in these trials actively promoted CBT and GET as being, you know, life-changing and effective when you read their trial protocols, which should have really disqualified them. The 8 was done by a physician researcher who didn't have a belief either way and found no benefit from either CBT or GET. But the really, really weird thing is that 5 of those studies, they were all done in, you know, between 2005 and 2000, well, during the 2000s. They used the Oxford diagnostic criteria, which were outmoded 20 years previously. There was no rational explanation for why they would have used those criteria for inclusion, because we knew that they defined a really heterogeneous group of people who, in all likelihood, did not have ME/CFS. And in fact, they went further than that, and they excluded people with moderate to severe disorder who probably did have ME/CFS. So it's not entirely clear who the populations that they were doing these graded exercise therapy trials on were. They probably weren't people with ME/CFS. They also only used subjective measures of fatigue. None of them used objective measures like quality of life or any objective measure of functioning, such as how far can you walk, return to employment or education, ability to engage in activities of daily living. None of them used objective criteria at all. They only used subjective criteria of improvement. So they were shoddy studies, basically. But that is what drove the Cochrane criteria finding, and that's what's driven all of our treatment guidelines. The biggest one of all was the PACE trial, which I'll just go through quickly, because again, it just describes some of the bias, really. So this was the biggest trial that's ever been done for anybody with ME/CFS. 641 patients broken into 4 groups. One was a control group, one was CBT, one was GET, and one was pacing. But strangely, the authors changed their criteria for defining improvement and recovery a month after the trial had closed and they'd received all of their data, which is a bit of a no-no. The strange thing is that they didn't admit that they'd done that. And in fact, it took a Freedom of Information request that got escalated to the High Court in the UK to be able to get access to their trial data, because they tried to stop people from accessing it. Because people realised that what they'd published didn't correlate with what they'd registered as their trial protocol. And so the reanalysis based on access to the original data showed that in fact there wasn't a 60% improvement and there wasn't a 22% recovery. They had changed the criteria for recovery. They decreased it such that you were defined as recovered by meeting the entry criteria to the trial. It was beautiful. You were sick enough to get into the trial, then you were well enough to have recovered from it. So you kind of met recovery criteria even before they started to get in a CBT. And I sort of said to a academic friend of mine, "This is scientific fraud," and she said, "No, this is just normal practice. This is really common, shoddy research." And it is unfortunate because the PACE trial gained a lot of momentum around the whole psychogenic basis of the disorder. CBT and GET were in all major guidelines. CDC has now withdrawn it, apologised to patients. NICE and Cochrane have withdrawn and they're redeveloping. But interestingly, I looked on our health pathways for CFS and it says the only two effective treatments are CBT and GET. Problem is, while CBT is probably useful for helping people adapt to having a chronic illness, graded exercise therapy may actually be harmful. And this is the experience of people who've undergone graded exercise therapy, pretty big cohort of people. Again, this is post hoc survey based, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's a pretty good indication. And it's not that surprising because graded exercise therapy forces people to push past their energy envelope. So it pushes them into the push and crash cycle. So it's not surprising that people get worse on it, maybe harmed, some may be permanently harmed. So I guess the general rule of thumb needs to be, if somebody has, moderate to severe post-exertional malaise and you know they have push crash, they shouldn't do graded exercise. And it's probably safer to say people with ME/CFS shouldn't do graded exercise, although in fact some of them, a small number of them, might improve. But the post-exertional malaise should be your best clue to avoiding graded exercise therapy. I think we've kind of talked about the research challenges, I won't go on about that too much. Management of primary care. So, maintaining uncertainty in diagnosis, that's pretty easy because it's pretty uncertain. But also considering that there are a range of other conditions that can look like ME but which aren't ME. And we have to go through each of them. Necessary investigations, most of the guidelines recommend minimal investigation, but in fact it should be necessary investigation. There shouldn't necessarily be a cap on it because we're not actually encouraging people by investigating them or encouraging them in their illness beliefs, but there is a law of diminishing returns because most of the investigations we have are pretty blunt. And they don't actually access any of the core pathology that's been identified. So again, it's kind of excluding things. Symptom management is the key. Sleep, pain, orthostatic intolerance. That gets the biggest benefit by a long stretch. There's often medication sensitivity. We're not quite sure why that is. And so avoiding medication and avoiding speculative trials of medication is probably the thing. And we've been there, we've tried every wacky thing under the sun. We had a hyperbaric oxygen chamber in our hallway up until the weekend. We've tried low-dose naltrexone, multivitamins, you name it. And there's no evidence to support any of it. And, you hope for the miracle cure, but actually some of these things might actually be harmful. So probably the generic advice is avoid trials of wacky things. And avoid expensive multivitamin treatments because they just make it for expensive urine. But you know, some things can be helpful in managing sleep. Melatonin, for instance. Magnesium can sometimes actually be quite helpful for managing sleep at night time. And you know, these are more child nursing psychiatry tricks, but trying to sort out sleep is important. Some people have used stimulants with good effect when the sleep patterns have been enduring. Managing managing POTS, so increasing fluid about 2 litres per day, fluid and salts basically, increasing circulating blood volume is the key. That's a pretty brutal amount of salt to take, it's actually hard to take, and it makes you feel nauseous. So there are various preparations of salt, electrolyte solutions that are reasonably affordable, and some not so affordable, which can help you to get there. If that's not effective, then the kind of treatment escalation is fludrocortisone, beta blockers, midodrine. Some people are actually using pyridostigmine, but I wouldn't recommend that at the moment until we have a decent trial of it.
In the previous slide you talked about pacing. Is that?
Yeah, I'll get onto. I've got a slide on that in a second. There it is. Yeah, well spotted. So pacing is really, you know, the key, and it's been the most effective strategy for most people. So essentially, it's about managing your energy envelope. You've got so much energy to expend. That's both cognitive and physical energy. You've got to ration it, and you've got to manage it, and you've got to stop before you hit your peak. So the best thing is to find out, you know, get a sense of where the peak is, and usually that's from assessing push and crash cycles, then dialing it back by 20%. And so you're wanting to do 8% of your peak every day, regardless of how you feel. I mean, sure, if you feel absolutely lousy, you're not going to do that. But the idea is to, on a bad day, do a little bit more than you feel like, and on a good day, do less than you feel like. Don't push yourself, because the thing with kids in particular is that when they're feeling good, they'll want to do more and more and more, and they'll crash. So it's about understanding that push-crash cycle in each patient. Where is their individual threshold? How much is too much for them, and then dialing it back and trying to get them to engage in activity that's about 20% shy of that threshold, to keep them active and to keep them functioning.
So do you mean 20% shy of your maximum heart rate?
No, of activity level, which isn't necessarily correlated with heart rate at all. In fact, on the CPET testing, people with significant moderate to severe POTS, their heart rate was limited. It did not, you know, when exercise actually went down, which again was pretty pathological. So heart rate's probably not the best guide. There is a Dallas exercise protocol that helps you to manage recumbent exercise for people with POTS up to an energy envelope using heart rate as an indicator. But it's not an evidence-based protocol, but it's probably quite a useful protocol. And you know, people can either manage that or they can't. So the thing with activity and POTS as well is that don't do your exercise upright because you're not getting your venous return. Do it recumbent. Swimming if you don't get hypothermic in the pool, or a recumbent cycle. Possibly a rowing machine, I guess, but anything that's not upright exercise. Alternating rest and activity, stopping well short of when you want to so that you can do another package of activity later on in the day, sort of thing. Pacing at school, maybe not doing a full day, going along for the core subjects, and not doing the extra subjects. Managing pointless exercise like climbing up and down stairs at school. And then if post-exertional malaise occurs, you've got to reduce your target. Keep on doing that. So pacing is probably the most useful strategy.
Have you heard of spoon theory?
I've heard of it. I don't know much about it actually.
You find that quite useful to explain living with chronic fatigue patients.
So basically based on pacing, you can look it up on the internet. It's something that people with chronic fatigue talk about spoon theory quite a lot, using spoons as a metaphor for the amount of energy they have.
Right. Okay.
It's just energy budgeting.
Yeah, well, yeah, pacing really much.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's the key. It is about recognising how much energy you've got, deciding how you're going to spend it, and allocating it to different tasks, and knowing when to stop. Which is actually a lot easier for adults to do than it is for adolescents who really struggle with that energy budget. So I think I'll stop here. I mean, I've got a bunch of other slides that are kind of appendices and, you know, websites, different bits of information. Do watch the movie Unrest. It's fantastic. It's quite stunning. It's called Unrest. So Jennifer Breer made a documentary about her experience of suffering with ME/CFS and other people with severe ME/CFS, including some of the, you know, research. I mean, it was 2016, so some of the lab stuff. It's a staggering movie. It's a remarkable insight into what it's like to live with a disorder. And it's kind of activist as well. But that's been a real game changer for people with ME/CFS. I highly recommend it. It's on Netflix. Any questions? Oh yeah, sorry, that was the appendices. So two fantastic resources. There is a paediatric primer for ME/CFS and an adult primer. They're great resources for primary care.
Go to the website. Go to the websites. So the primers are in the first website and the second website, and the CDC.
Yeah, so if you just Google paediatric primer, ME/CFS, you'll find it as well. These websites are all really good resources. But that's a much more detailed kind of treatment guide than I've been able to provide today. So I hope I've kind of talked about, you know, how we can reconceptualise ME/CFS, kind of what the evidence is pointing towards and what the direction of travel is and where we've been. So that, you know, we need to understand the context of ME/CFS to be able to make much progress in the treatment. Well, I don't really have much definitive treatment guidance to give you. That's probably, you know, the primers are the best kind of resource for that.
Being GPs, we obviously don't have time for a lot of this. We refer, and I've had some really good responses from, I don't actually know what pediatricians, but pediatricians and some of my patients have got a lot better with their help. Are you happy with the help that you've had in the Greater Wellington area as a consumer? And can you recommend which specific areas we should